Good morning to everyone and welcome. My name is Mariana Buquerque, Project Manager at the Brazilian Center for International Relations, CEBRI. Today, we are very pleased to host the event, The Political Economy of Innovation Strategies in the Post-Pandemic World, How to Align Global and Local Priorities. This panel is part of a larger project of CEBRI's Multilateralism program coordinated by Professor Ana Jaguaribe. The project, in partnership with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, focuses on key areas of the multilateral agenda, such as regional arrangements, trade, climate change, and, as it is the case for today's event, political economy and innovation. To that end, we are honored to receive distinguished guests as Dan Bresnitz and Heiner Kattel. Before introducing our moderator and passing the floor to him, I would like to invite Aline Soares, Project Coordinator of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Brazil, for her introductory remarks.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome all. I would like to greet each of you who are watching us and salute our guests for the opportunity to debate this very important topic. It's an honor for Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and I'm sure it's also for CEBRI to count on your enthusiasm to praise this event, with the presence of renowned speakers working in Brazil and abroad in the areas of international relations, economics, and political science. CAS has been working in Brazil over 50 years with projects in different thematic fields, numerous activities, publications, especially in the area of international cooperation. So I would like to take the opportunity to invite you to our event for the Copacabana International Security Conference to be held September 16 and 17, and invite you to check out our website, follow our institutional social media at CAS Brazil. I would like to thank CEBRI for this institutional partnership and also hope we will be able to meet you soon in person. I wish you all an excellent debate, and now I'll pass the floor to the next colleague. Thank you very much for all.
Thank you, Aline, and thank you for CAS for this long-lasting partnership. To start today's event, I would like to pass the floor to our moderator and specialist, Caetano Pena, Senior Research Fellow in Global Sustainability Transitions at Utrecht University. Thank you, Caetano. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mariana. Let me also mention my Brazilian affiliation at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. I'm currently in unpaid leave, but someone from my institution said, you have to always mention you are also from UFRJ. So now here I am, mention it. I'm very proud of it, and I'm always contributing also indirectly with it. So welcome everyone. I'm pleased to host this event. And I would like to share with you also the tool that we'll be using to interact. So I invite you to enter the address www.menti.com and use the code that I'm sharing with you in the chat. But I will also share the screen now so that you can see. So you should enter www.menti.com and use the code 46560537. Meanwhile, I'll be doing the opening, and I invite you to share with us where are you right now. You write your country if you enter that address and you enter the code. You will be able to enter your country in the panel, although it is saying that it is closed. No, now it's not closed, now it's open. So the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic made explicit the risk of relying on globalized value chains for essential supplies, be them basic textile, protective masks, for instance, or advanced chemical like active or pharmaceutical ingredients. While technological sovereignty has always been a fundamental goal of industrial catching up strategies from the United States and Germany in the 18th or 19th century through the Asian tigers and Latin American economies in the 20th century to China nowadays, and a core concern to classical political economists, the pandemic seemed to come as a wake-up call to currently developed nations challenging the free market political economy that prevailed at the global arena since the 1970s. Indeed, technological sovereignty is now a top priority in many national government's agenda, and the Biden plan to reshore the US industrial base and decouple its value chain from China is the obvious example of this impetus. The renewed interests in technological sovereignty, a national priority, generates tensions with the agenda of the Sustainable Development Goals, for instance, which addresses many problems that are global in nature. On the one hand, we see the prospects of a new round of protectionist technological strategies and interstate competition. On the other, the SDG agenda calls for a global strategy and technological cooperation. The fact that world leaders failed to coordinate and cooperate to address the COVID-19 pandemic and instead compete to guarantee, for example, the supply of vaccines to their own countries, shows that even in the face of a common urgent threat, aligning global and local priorities is an elusive task. Under the scenario that unfolds, the space for multilateral agreements and global cooperation seem ever more diminished. This roundtable discusses this tension and seeks to address questions such as how does this new impetus towards technological sovereignty reframes science, technology, and innovation policies at the local, regional, national, and global levels? Has the political economy of innovation strategies changed? What lessons can we take from the COVID-19 pandemic for the alignment of local and global priorities and for the strategies to address them? Why do national governments fail to cooperate in addressing common threats? And what are the risks of the push towards technological sovereignty to the global SDG agenda? What are the alternatives to technological sovereignty in building a resilient system of production that is fair and inclusive? So today with me, I have two distinguished guests, and I'm very happy to have them here. It was funny when I invited both of them, because both replied, well, I'd be very happy to be in the round table with the other. So they both explicitly said so. So I'm happy to bring you both on board. And first, I will invite Professor Dan Bresnitz, who is Munk Chair of Innovation Studies and co-director of the Political Innovation Laboratory at the University of Toronto's Munk School and co-director of the Canadian Institute of Advanced Research, Innovation, Equity, and Future Program. Professor Bresnitz has published many different books, and the most recent one is in Innovation in Real Places, which I will invite him to talk about soon. So Dan, please welcome, and thanks again for being here.
Thank you so much, Sedano. It's a pleasure, especially since you finally, Rainer and I were talking, I think, for 4 years that we should meet each other again. And then your email came and said, yes, yes. But let me talk about the subject for a moment. As you said, I just published the book, Innovation in Real Places, and it's called Innovation in Real Places because the book really tried to figure out what can leaders of a place, a city, a region, a community can do in order to develop policies that allow them to have innovation-based local prosperity, and how globalization impacts that. That's exactly what is the book about. And I argue that there are multiple models. With regard, and we can talk about it more, but with regard to your question, I think that what COVID has done is indeed broke down two very dangerous myths that we had. One myth is that we have a resilient global networks, production networks, which can actually withhold anything that we want and give us anything that we want, whether or not we as a locale have the innovation capacity to produce and develop the stuff we need. And the second, it has opened the eyes of policymakers to the questions of how they reach prosperity for their own people, and not just globally, and not just how they produce a huge amount of profit, but how do they really create growth strategy that allows everybody, or at least as many people in that community, to reach what we used to call the middle class. With regard to the global production networks, what we have found, which shouldn't have come as a surprise to anyone who actually does research about it, is that we don't have global production networks. We have networks that are very concentrated in specific stages of activities in specific places. Most of the actual physical production, the last two stages, is done in, let's call it, the Greater China region. And when bad things happen, by the way, it happens even before the pandemic, if you remember the Japan nuclear disaster, suddenly the whole world doesn't have the things that it needs. In the pandemic, it became very clear that even if you invent, right, not innovate, but invent the things like ventilators or N95 masks, if you no longer know how to produce them and innovate in their production, when as they say, the shit hit the fan, you don't have ventilators and masks. And when you don't have ventilators and masks and you have a pandemic, people die. And that's sharpened demand. So the question is what you need to do. And let's talk about the global first. The global first is, I do not think that we will have a full national sovereignty of all production and all innovation. A, it does not make sense. B, it's almost impossible unless you're a massive country. And even then, I'm not sure it's possible. What we should do is probably create a real resiliency in our network. And a real resiliency in our network means that you have places which, just like now, focus on one stage of innovation and production, but you have multiple of them. So you have several, let's call, regional production networks. You have a main one, which I don't think is going to change, which is very China region reliant. But if we have another set of networks, one closer to, let's call it, the Americas, and one closer to Europe, Middle East, Africa, that works all the time, when a real pandemic happened, and the next one is just around the corner, we really have a portfolio of production of innovation globally. In terms of locally, and I think this is the most important, if you are a leader of a community, you need to understand how globalization works. Globalization works by setting a product or a service and then making it in discrete stages in different places. Okay, so if we talk about the semiconductor industry, Silicon Valley and maybe Tel Aviv and a few other places sort of come up with new ideas to put on silicon. Then, as we now know, it goes to Taiwan in order to make it happen. And indeed, the United States had to beg a Taiwanese company to just beg them to open manufacturing facilities in the US, because the US no longer has the capacity to do that. Then it goes many times to locales that focus on one or two critical components like memory, like screen control, like LCDs. And then somebody actually needs to bring those sometimes 10,000 different components, put them in a really tiny thing and produce that smartphone that you use. So if you look at the semiconductor industry, we can run through a list of countries: Israel, United States, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, China. All of them have extremely successful semiconductor industry. In many of them, you have the same companies work. But when you look at what is the Chinese semiconductor industry, what is the United States semiconductor industry, it's a completely different thing. And in order to excel in each of those stages, right, within the same industry, you need to have very different innovational capacities, very different institution, finance, higher education, way in which you work together, those companies, how those companies then institutionally relate to the global production network. And that leads me to the two things that I want people to remember. One, We care about innovation because it brings welfare and economic growth. But innovation is not invention. It's not the coming up with a new shiny thing. And I think the pandemic had made it very clear. It is not enough to invent a vaccine. You have to innovate through all the production of that vaccine, and then through all the distribution of that vaccine, so everybody on Earth will be vaccinated. So it's great that you come up with a new idea, but you have to constantly innovate it, constantly improve its production, constantly improve the products, right? Probably by October, we will need a booster. That's one. The second, people are obsessed with Silicon Valley and the Silicon Valley model. If you look at that model, it has created on one side amazing companies and huge amount of wealth, and on the other side, unbelievable inequality in the community where it has been successful. San Francisco, Tel Aviv are now two of the world's most unequal places. And the reason is the same, globalization. Because if you focus on that stage, you basically employ only R&D personnel. They also get massive financial incentives. You focus really on financial exits, but all the spillovers from that stage now happen somewhere else. And if I would now argue other places to think about innovation policy and innovation growth, I would ask them, why do you want to have innovation-based growth? If you want a resilient community to the next pandemic, and you want a wider prosperity, I would dump any ideas of trying to imitate Silicon Valley and instead look at the other three stages of production and figure out how can you play there. That will produce more jobs for more people with different kind of skills. It will be a sustained growth. And when the pandemic happens, it will be places like this, like Taiwan, for example, that can rejig itself and produce the things that are most needed by its citizens when they are most needed. Thank you so much for having me here. I hope to have a fun debate soon.
No, it was really clear, and it already made me think about some questions that I will just throw here, and then we return to them. The first is about, I think you are talking about resilience as redundancy, so that you have more than one place that produce or that executes parts of the production. That's fine, but I remember you both, Rainer and you, participated in the round of interviews last year, and there was also someone that I interviewed from China, and his claim was that this kind of redundancy would be costly and inefficient from an economic perspective. I know that there is also an agenda behind that statement, but then I would like to know your take on that. So if we have multiple places doing the same, couldn't it actually result in a more costly production process? And that's the one, so I'll leave it there. The other one, also in Brazil, curiously, we do have a state-owned microchip company called CETEC, and now we are talking about privatizing it, or actually it's not even privatized, it's shutting it down. So I would like to know, actually, not that we maybe would be able to compete with the leaders, but what role could Brazil play in if we would like to join? Is it possible for us to join this semiconductor industry? And the final one is, I think it's very interesting to say, it's not enough to invent a vaccine. You also, and maybe even more important, you need to be able to produce it, and you need to be able to distribute it. So I'd like to know what you think about this new proposal that developed countries are going to make the patents public, or everybody will be able to use those patents. So what would be the effects of this, of letting go of the intellectual property rights if invention is not sufficient? So, but we will return to these three questions later. I now would like to invite Professor Rainer Cattell. is Professor of Innovation and Public Governance at the Institute for Innovation Public Purpose, and also the Deputy Director of the Institute for Innovation Public Purpose at the University College London. Thank you, Rainer. Please welcome. And
yeah, equally, it's such a great pleasure to be here, and really nice to see both Dan and you, Caetano, as well. Old friends, and I can imagine if without pandemic we would have been all in Brazil, I guess, and having a really nice time, because there are so many friends who think alike in this space of innovation and industrial policy. So it's a real pity, but you know, shout out to everybody in Brazil. And yeah, I really enjoyed Dan's first intervention as well. So I think in the European context, the idea of technological sovereignty has a really interesting connotation. And it's very closely related to one city, actually, ironically, which is Barcelona. And the city of Barcelona, and especially the work of Francesca Bria, who was for, and Ada Colau was the mayor of Barcelona still, and Francesca Bria, who was the chief technology officer of Barcelona for 3 or 4 years. And she and also Evgeny Morozov, they were very strongly focused in technological sovereignty and the idea around the idea of digital technologies and around the idea of data and data ownership, and that citizens should actually own the data that they are producing constantly through, you know, mobility, consuming electricity, whatnot. And so they had this very strong and really interesting work, and actually applied it in you know, public procurement processes, and that the public procurement should be all sort of based on open standard open data. So all these really interesting things, I think that Caetano, you were also asking Dan from, I mean, Barcelona tried to implement, but very specifically in the digital realm. And I think this slowly has become the European agenda, but also in the sort of the digital economy space, because of, if you look at the map of digital platforms, you by now have these two polar opposites in China and US having all the big companies, and Europe in the middle, basically playing the role of tax havens, like the Netherlands and other places. So which I think for European policymakers is sort of like, what happened there? How do we lost it? And I think, so this is where the digital sovereignty, even before COVID, became a really important issue, but not from a sort of an industrial or production point of view, but really from the ownership of data, and actually also the idea of value extraction. So why are we allowing our data to be used for the purposes for private companies, by private companies? And I think this has been quite successful. And of course, I think this is where COVID really changed the narrative of technological sovereignty, which became very much about production capabilities and things like that. And then over the last 12 months and so has also really reinforced this European industrial policy, which even like 3 years ago, nobody wanted to use the word in Brussels, but now, you know, people fall over trying to, you know, be the first to talk about the industrial policy. And so I think this is very much an emerging agenda. And if you know anything about European Union, you know that if something is emerging, it will take another 7 years before it becomes a policy, actually. But I think what is really important to understand in this context is that digital sovereignty has very much shifted from the citizen-focused, data-driven discussions towards geopolitics. So it's very much about essentially big companies in Germany being worried that they might be bought up by Chinese companies, or European policymakers being constantly asked, why don't you have unicorns, or why do you have only a handful of unicorns in ICT in Europe? And you know, you have this ironic situation that my own small country, Estonia, has more unicorns than France, which is really ironic if you think about it. You know, Estonia has 1.2 million people. And there is you know, hardly any venture capital. There is no local financial sector. All the banks are foreign owned. So it's a really anomaly that you have it. But of course, for a European policymaker, that's really is a big blunder, I think. And so this is sort of the setting the scene, I think, from the European perspective. And I think then sort of COVID happens, I think, you know, and partially accelerates all of those topics. And I think this is what I would see is a window of opportunity. Because if you are, you know, for instance, European country right now, fiscal rules don't apply to you. So you can spend very differently as a government. And I think this is also having a great impact on you know, issues like not only fiscal policy, but even the central banking. whether the central bank's mandates are being questioned. Should the central bank mandate be only about, inflation targeting and keeping inflation at 2%, or does it have also employment target? And you see across the Atlantic, Joe Biden's administration is very much pushing this agenda that inflation is not that big of a deal. And Japan, European Union, of course, have the exact opposite. They would like some inflation, actually, but even with a massive spending, there is not enough inflation going on. So I think what I would see this technological sovereignty more in the sense of a window for an opportunity to re-engage with innovation, and especially I think industrial policy for many countries, because there is sort of opening up or loosening of policy space, I would perhaps call it. I don't think it's really open yet, but so I think some countries will definitely use it, and this is where the capacities and will come to play a big role, and I'll come to that. But I think at the moment we're in this very interesting critical point where, yes, loosening up of the agenda is really interesting, but what will this loosening up mean? Does it mean that actually incumbents have more power in the system? So incumbent companies, like, let's say, if you look at countries like Sweden, Norway, but even countries like Korea, where industry is doing the most of the investments in R&D, so they are leading the agenda already. So if the agenda is more loosened, does that mean that incumbents can actually have a more say in policy, and less focus will go to, for instance, inequality? Again, Germany is the world leader in exports, but they have an increasing inequality. So if you look at German data, they have to increasingly spend on social transfers to keep inequality low. So you have this an amazing situation where we have completely separated social policy and R&D policy, and we do a very different tracks. And I think while there's an opening to try to combine them, I think this will be quite difficult. So I think really the interesting bit is that there is this opening of the policy space, and this is, I think, where the idea of capacity becomes so important and relevant, the public sector capacity. And I think this is the big lesson from COVID, I think, is indeed that the public sector capacity matters greatly, both in terms of having long-term investments into health systems and whatnot, production systems, but also, of course, having the more dynamic capabilities of able to react and shape what's going on. And I think this is where the idea of redundancy becomes really interesting. So, because I think, our sort of, especially I think the Western model of public sector is very much looking towards how do we diminish redundancies in public sector? So how do we get it more efficient? And I think what the COVID showed that we have the wrong idea of redundancy. Redundancy is not about whether we have, 2 hospitals in the same city or something like that, but it's actually, redundancy is exactly it's the opposite of resilience, I guess. And so if you don't have resilience, you have probably something like redundancy. And I think this sort of the idea of having a lot of the core capacities being outsourced in hospital systems, in other systems like digital response systems, I think became very, very obvious, especially I think in the European context. And even up to today, you have, I think Germany is only this week starting to issue electronic vaccination certificates. Before that, they were on paper. And so this is the leading European industrial country that cannot issue digital vaccination certificates. So that shows you how the public sector capacity has been evolving. And in terms of coming to risks, I think there is from the idea of technological sovereignty, I think really the main issue is that we are seeing this in emergence of sort of like a new Cold War between US and China. I think the G7 over the last weekend you can see it as a very much of a US attempt to get everybody else in the Western board to build a sort of the wall against Chinese influence. And I think this is, the danger is that while we talk a lot about green transition and inequality and using innovation, widening the scope of innovation policy more towards sort of social behavioral innovations around food, all of those, great issues. I think there's a great danger that because of this overarching geopolitical agenda, we see the emergence of a new sort of military industrial complex that will, essentially hijacks the industrial policy agenda. And then you have the other danger. I think there's really the danger of greenwashing So every country is now again having like sort of green targets, green industrial policy, or trying to have green energy policy. And at the same time, I think very few countries are doing something new. So they're just sort of saying that this is a green policy, while it's very convenient for policymakers to say that by 2040 we are, neutral, or because they won't be in power, so they don't really care what happens after 4 or 5 years. So I think it's very easy to be very green, I think, without actually being that green. And I think the danger is also that we continue on this separation of both sort of macroeconomic policies of inflation targeting, and especially the social policies, and R&D and innovation policy. And this separation, I think, is really at the root of what Dan was talking about as well. So because we are so happy to count patents or graduates in math and things like that, rather than look at the more balanced view of societies. But I will stop here, and looking forward to the debate as well.
Thank you, Rainer. Fascinating. I think that you point, I think, to a very important aspect, that a country may achieve, let's say, technological sovereignty and still don't have a social welfare or equality, or still have social issues, which is, I think, an important lesson also to developing countries. I would like also to leave a question to you about this type of digital sovereignty. And the question is whether, well, countries like Estonia, who probably sought this agenda of digital sovereignty or a digital strategy, were more resilient when a crisis like the COVID-19 came, or not? So do you see a process of this bottom-up build-up of resilience that actually resulted in this more geopolitical type of sovereignty that we're talking about right now? And the other question I wanted to ask, or maybe it's a bit of a challenge in the sense that, okay, we may have countries that do have a type of institutional capacity. They could be prepared to deal with the pandemic, but because of, let's say, political will or the kind of political leaders that were there, this capacity could not be properly deployed. Maybe that was the case even with Brazil. If you think about the type of institutions that we have, even Fiocruz, the Ministry of Health, they were quite well prepared. I think we do have a good capacity there, but we were not an example, to put it euphemistically, of how to combat the pandemic. So what happened there, and what is the relationship between, let's say, political capacity or political will and policy capacity? I'll leave you with these two questions while I return to Dan. Dan, I raised three questions to you. The first was about how Brazil, for instance, or developing countries in general could join this field, what type of strategies. The second about whether it was costly to have this kind of redundancy of global value chains. And the third one was about, well, what would be the effects of breaking up the patent so everybody have access to these rights?
So let me first actually relate to Professor Catel's comments, because I think he put in one issue which is of critical importance, and that is the fact that we have to merge the two silos of both policymaking and research. One is what he calls social policy or distributional policies, and one is innovation policies. And indeed, as you've said, I'm the co-director and fellow of CEFAR, project on innovation, equity, and the future for prosperity. And that's exactly the reason we, which is myself, Amos Zahavi from Tel Aviv, and Susan Helper, who has now left us for a year to join the White House, Biden administration, to exactly try to do that in America, is doing, because we actually do not know. We have the wrong data. The people who know how to do social policy never talked with the innovation people who do innovation policy, and vice versa. And neither of us are talking to historians, law scholars, or engineers. So we created this program specifically to create it as a subfield of research. What I would argue, and my first attempt to do this was together with my co-author Amos Zahavi, we created a set of ways to think about innovation policies, which we call distribution sensitive innovation policies, which says exactly that. When you design the policy, you also have to figure out, or at least think about, what will be the distributional outcome. And then you can actually make an informed choice. And you can, from the start, think about what kind of innovation policies would at least not increase inequality, what some of them might do in order to increase equality, and how to go on about it. And I would be delighted to talk with anyone who so wishes about DSIPs. And I call them DSIPs because I actually have no clue what inclusive innovation is, because people are now using it for whatever they want. So I know it's inclusion, I know it's innovation. I tried with another colleague, Dan Monroe, to create a monitor, so we'll at least figure out what is the kind of data, whether we have more inclusive innovation or not. And I can tell you that it's a great trend, which is now fast becoming meaningless, almost like social innovation. Now, about your question, and I'll start with the last one. I found it unbelievably cynical to have a debate about those patents. First of all, the Moderna vaccine is now open to anyone who wants to know how to make it. The recipe is online, thanks to a researcher from Stanford. And the reason Moderna couldn't care less, at least for now, is that no one, apart from its suppliers and maybe the suppliers of Pfizer's, know how to make mRNA vaccines. So it's great to say, oh, we'll give you the patents. But if you don't have innovational capacity and the knowledge to produce, the patents are not helpful. And countries, Canada, for example, supposedly a developed economy that I'm living in, have no clue and no capacity unless you now give us not just the patent, but the people who know how to do it, a huge amount of money in a year to produce mRNA vaccines. So I found it as a very cynical ploy. Maybe it will matter long-term, right, whether we change the IP regime, because the IPR regime we now have globally is completely dysfunctional if what you want is more innovation and growth. But if you want vaccines in developed country and the only thing you give them is, oh, I wouldn't sue you over patents, this is a very cynical ploy because the chances that they can do something with it are very slim. Now let's talk about the rest. What do you mean by cost? So here is an answer to your Chinese friend. Taking trees, a huge amount of trees, growing them in Canada, cutting them down, then moving them on the most polluting thing on earth, which are big container ships, to China, so they can be cut down into small pieces of wood and then moved back to Canada. Of course, it's cheap in terms of money, but if you internalize just the environmental cost, this is unbelievably expensive. And that's basically what we do. We lie. The cost that you see as a consumer is an absolute lie, because the real cost, social cost, environmental cost, and the rest is not internalized in the price. The second is, I'm sorry, when you buy insurance, you might not want to buy the cheapest insurance. You buy insurance, so when the bad times happen, you are insured. You do, at least I do, and I hope also the manager of my pension do, have a portfolio, not in order to maximize the current profits, but when I will retire in X amount of years, I will have money, because whatever happens, I have a portfolio. And that's the idea of a portfolio. That's the price. The second is, not having those innovational capacities means that you cannot innovate. And that's another price. So what I hope the pandemic did is open our mind to all those other prices that are not just, in how many cents cost a piece of plastic. In terms of Brazil, here's what I will say. The Taiwanese have started it from a state-owned enterprise, right? From a public research institute called ITRI. Everything was spun off with the help of the government as quickly as possible to the private market, and then helped and sustained so it became globally competitive. It did not stay state-owned enterprises because they wanted to figure out how to work in a global system. So the role of the state, at least in my opinion, is to create, there's only two innovation actors in the economy, entrepreneurs and companies. And the role of a state is to create the capabilities for entrepreneurs and companies that can actually do something, and the knowledge that they do that, help them do that. When there's no companies like Taiwan that I just mentioned, maybe step in and help creating the companies. But the state cannot be the long-term agent of innovation, not invention, of innovation, and become the economy. And I think that's what happened, at least from the very brief sentences that you gave us in Brazil. So I would argue, figure out what capacities you have, because you have an immense set of capacities because you have that industry, and how you can recombine them to create competitive companies, whether or not it would be fabrication facilities or not.
Well, thank you very much. I think that you've challenged not only my Chinese colleague, but also mainstream economists that actually externalize those costs in their models. Rainer, please, your take either on the questions I raised, also to react to them. Feel free.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I would, as I did in the chat, I would highly recommend Dan's article on the distribution-sensitive innovation policies. This is really a path-breaking research, and I hope to read more soon. So it's very, very interesting. So and I think just to add on this specific issue, if you look at the government spending in GDP, a lot of it is actually on public services. It is on education. It is on social services. All of those things, and it's much higher budgets than R&D budgets are, or science budgets are. So, and we don't really look at them from this perspective at all. Sorry, I'm in the office for the first time in a couple of weeks, so it seems to be different air than at home. So opening up has some costs. So you asked Katon about digital capabilities, and a country like Estonia, which everybody I guess knows is one of those digital leaders in digital government, especially. And I think it's really interesting that Estonia's digital government played almost no role in their response to COVID, and quite the opposite. It was almost a complete failure, down to the issue of having to have lists of who should get vaccinated in Excel sheets and things like that. So supposedly we have a very, very good digital government infrastructure, but it didn't play a role. I think it doesn't really necessarily have to do with digital government. There is a very specific fact that Estonia doesn't have a central digital agency. It's a very decentralized system, which is very good in times of non-crisis, I guess. But as crisis hit, you might need a central agency to take charge. But I think what's even more important is that many European countries were very much unwilling to learn the lessons from East Asian economies or East Asian countries, because East Asian countries had come through SARS, so they were actually, I think, much readily accepting all kinds of quite draconian measures, and were very readily also quickly investing into digital tools. So I think there is much more to do with learning the lessons. I don't know whether you have followed the UK's domestic politics, but a couple of weeks ago we had Dominic Cummings, who used to be an advisor to the Prime Minister, a very controversial advisor during the COVID crisis, and he was giving evidence in the parliamentary committee, and he said that what UK government should have done in March 2020 is just download and translate Singapore, Taiwan's crisis response and do it. And why it wasn't done has partially to do with sort of racist arguments that what do they know in Asia? We are here in Europe, and we know. And I think this is sort of spilled over into countries like Estonia as well, partially. And this leads me nicely to your second question, Gatan, about the political capabilities or capacity. And yet Brazil is obviously one example, but UK is another example. I mean, UK had a very, very strong crisis management system that was based on local governments. But out of some reason, the government in place decided, no, we need to outsource the entire response to crisis, the developing of digital systems, developing track and trace systems for billions and billions of pounds. And this was an utter failure, and still is an utter failure. Only when government really fell back into internal capabilities that they have in NHS, National Health Service, but also within government digital service, which are all public agencies, did they something good. So this is a really interesting lesson that, yes, political capacity, if you will, plays a really interesting role. And I think this has to do with a changing of mass politics. I think that we are used to from 20th century, we are used to having these big blocks, labor and capital. But if you now look who's the voter of social democrats in the European context, these are not, workers. These are not people in mines or in industrial companies. These are people who live in cities, who have office jobs. And so it's a very big shift in politics that I think especially the left-wing politicians haven't really understood. And I think the right-wing has much better understood the opportunities of provided by Facebook and other ways of influencing very, very quickly and playing on the division rather than on consensus. Thank you.
Thank you, right. Well, I would like to continue with you and to continue talking about capacities a bit. You are at the IIPP right now, as I understand. It's a bit open the office. It's to ventilate a bit, but yes, it is a leading institution on mission-oriented policy, the concept, and we have this new trend, especially in the EU. We are talking a lot about mission-oriented policy. I would like you to reflect about the new type of public sector capacities and capabilities that are needed for this type of policies to be implemented, and also how the pandemic has highlighted these new capacities to achieve a clear mission, which is dealing with the pandemic.
Yeah, I think we have this mission-oriented policies. Of course, have quite a long history. Again, going back to the Cold War and all that. And I think then in 1980s they were surpassed, I guess, by more horizontal innovation policies, and now they're indeed making a comeback, and a lot of it has to do with this realization that the way we do innovation policy, especially in the developed countries, has been largely ineffectual. For instance, in issues that Dan was talking about, inequality, but also in terms of actually producing greener energy or greener solutions. And I think so. Over almost 2 decades, especially the European Union has sort of tried to shift its R&D focus towards more, tackling socio-economic, socio-technical challenges. And I think there are some of the countries are doing really interesting work. If you look at Sweden, for instance, in their innovation agency, Innova. And I think if you look at what are the key interesting capabilities, this is very much about can we reframe innovation policy targets in a way that they actually bring in some of those social issues. So, for instance, Sweden is trying to direct its investments in green energy, partially around food. So, how do we understand what do we do what's sort of the problem that we try to solve is, and they try to frame it through the idea that every child in school should have healthy, sustainable food. So this means that you have to sort of innovate across basically the value chain from energy, transportation to waste management. So I think this capability of trying to reframe and bring in all those actors around the table who are usually not in the room, because transportation is a very different from R&D. Usually, it's very often seen as a transportation policy is, we outsource or we hire some companies to deliver people in buses. We have metro systems, whatever. And similarly, waste system is usually not part of the innovation policy discussion. So they try to do these kind of bringing a different kind of system into the room, as it were. I think this is really interesting, but it requires enormous legitimacy to bring those actors around the table. And of course, what I think the next really interesting capability is around actually being able to implement those policies in a way that is more focused on experimental sort of aspects of actually learning as you go along, because the main issue that a lot of public agencies these days have is that they are not actually themselves involved in those innovation discussions. They're just sort of looking at project proposals and evaluating them and giving money to somebody else. And then you evaluate in 3 to 5 years what happened. So actually trying to be more agile, I think, is something that even agencies like Vinnova have a big challenge. So I think these two capabilities of reframing and having legitimacy to do so. And the other thing is actually building new implementation capabilities that are much more focused on learning, and rather than just distributing funding, I think is a really big challenge for many innovation agencies. I think that you have the same problem partially, I think, in the developing world. I think where UNIDO, for instance, is very strongly sort of pushing this agenda of SDGs and industrial policy for SDGs. I think it's the same question: how do we frame those policies then, if they're not about export, if they're not about FDI, if they're not about, how do we frame them? And it's also, of course, how do we implement those things? How do we design policies that are actually really, as Dan said, really inclusive? And what does it even mean to be inclusive in innovation policy? So yeah, these are really interesting challenges.
Thank you, Rainer. Yes, I tend to agree with you that the two aspects, legitimacy of those policies and how to frame them without reducing the problem to a certain type of solution. I think that's key, instead of saying, well, the issue of sustainability of the energy system is about diffusion of renewable energy sources, or diffusion of solar and wind energy. That is really very short-sighted. You have to probably frame it in a way that allows for experimentation, participation, and also to build resilience. So I think it's a very good insight. Then I would like to come back to one of your key messages in your opening statement that is also present in your new book, The Innovation in Real Places. I quote from your books, you say that success lies in understanding the changed structure of the global system of production, and then using those insights to enable communities to recognize their own advantages, which in turn allows them to foster surprising forms of specialized innovation. Could you give us some examples of these surprising forms of specialized innovation that you found, and also elaborate more about this point, and also reflect on how the pandemic have reinforced this insight or has challenged it?
Sure. So let me go to two different industries, and on purpose not, or at least they don't seem to be high tech. One of them is bicycles. You're in Holland at the moment, so I assume you have at least one bike, maybe a few, in your garage. And if you would look at your bike, you probably will see the word Shimano on them, because that's a company from a small place in Japan that has now, for the last 40 years, completely controlled all innovation in the power transfer system of bikes, so gears and everything else. And indeed, it's even more than, remember, Intel inside in a computer. I will challenge you to find a good bike in a reasonable price that doesn't have Shimano, no matter who else produces it. And that's exactly that opening. And if you look at the history of Shimano, they understood in the 70s that the world of bikes, which, let me remind everybody here, the basic design of a bike that we know was settled about 100-something years ago. There's the diamond frame and two wheels and something to navigate it. That's it. That has been decided 100-and-something years ago, and yet there's constant innovation. So Shimano is one. The second, going back to Taiwan, is Giant. So if your bike is lightweight and very strong, or if you ever had a mountain bike, or if you ever remember trends like BMX and then the mountain bikes, you probably had a bike manufactured by Giant, whether or not it's a Giant bike. And what Giant did is it saw the changes of globalization. So it started life as a sub-supplier of an American company, Schwein. When Schwein, it realized it is too much reliant on it. And then Schwein decided to move all its supplies to China, by the way, leading to its bankruptcy because it lost all its innovation capacity, but that's a different lesson. And what Giants and a few other bike companies from the same small Taiwanese city, not Taipei, not any city that you probably ever heard about, they have collaborated with ITRI, which is the government, but instead of electronics in the material science, figure out what is happening in the technology in the world. And the US was then developed a carbon fiber framework, actually for defense, speaking about the defense and resiliency. And together with ITRI, Giant and the other companies became the first in the world to master carbon fiber technology. And then Giant, not the state, figure out how to make money out of it and how to completely transform the bicycle industry, basically by controlling this diamond that I just mentioned. And even more interestingly, for your example before, I interviewed, and he's a good friend, Dr. Otto Lin, who used to be the president of ITRI, who was responsible for that project at the time. And he said, I actually went to them and asked them, why do you want this carbon fiber? Why should a bike company should have this advanced technology? And their answer was, don't worry, you will teach us how to do that. We already know how to make the money out of it. So those are one example. The second example is, I don't know if you buy luxury women's shoes. I hope you do if you love your partner. You need to buy them at least one or two shoes that cost about 2,000 euros, But if you do, all of them are becoming, no matter who is the designer and where he sends and what is the brand name, which is probably French or American, whatever, all of them are being made into reality, sort of the second stage. Somebody designed and then somebody actually have to figure out how to manufacture it in real product and then produce a prototype. So all of them are in a tiny region of Italy, Riviera del Brenta, just above Venezia in the Veneto. A tiny place which now control that niche that gives it massive sustainable advantage in that industry. Because it is the leading place for doing that, all the global companies come there to get their shoes manufacturers and made into prototypes. And what is interesting about it, that it actually came out from below. So if you look at the history of Brenta, it's not that it was there and always done luxury shoes. It actually was a sub-supplier of shoes, mostly for Germans, understood how the global production network are changing. Some entrepreneurs went to France to figure out how to start moving to luxury. Then they reconfigured the local school for shoe manufacturing, created a system of finance, creating a public-private policy infrastructure, figure out how to relate to designer in New York. And for the last 30 years, while other places and clusters in Italy were going down, Brenta is doing extremely well. And by the way, I will highly recommend talking to my friend Giulio Buccini, who's now in Ireland of all places, if you want to learn more about this industry.
Thank you, Dan. Actually, very fascinating. I'm going to Italy this summer. Maybe I'll visit the region and buy shoes for my wife. Hopefully it's a bit cheaper than the price you said. Otherwise I won't have money for the hotels. But I wanted to actually to do a follow-up question. It seems that all these examples that you gave, they were maybe business-led. So they identified the niche, they identified where they would be if inserting themselves and seizing the opportunity, or even creating this opportunity. Whilst when you talk about innovation strategies, national, local, we think about policy-led initiatives. So you do a foresight exercise, try to identify your capabilities. There is the trend towards smart specialization in Europe as well. So is it true? So it's business-led, but for developing countries that maybe lack those businesses to do this work, is there a role for the policymakers?
Of course. So I might have not been clear enough. E3, which is that massive public research institution, that out of it came all the semiconductor industry of Taiwan, is a public research institute, meaning it's a policy. It was a policy decision to create it. It's an organ of the state, and it created a model. Because it created the model and was also very active, constantly engaging with the industry, and also realizing that the semiconductor is not the only industry, it created those opportunities for entrepreneurs. But when there was nothing in Taiwan in the semiconductor industry, the state, by way together with a lot of help of American semiconductor engineers that understood the industry, went upon a very well-defined strategies of where it wanted to play in the semiconductor industry, which was very different than the American and the Japanese and the Korean industries of the time. The result is an unbelievably successful global industry, but each and every of the most important companies you can track down to not even E3, but the same lab in E3 span up at a different time. So of course, it really depends what you have in your regions and which capabilities lies where. And also, which is one thing that I think Professor Catal has mentioned a couple of times, but I think we should implicitly, and we should be very explicit, what is the culture, the political economy mode of that state? What is acceptable for the state to do? What is acceptable for the private industry to do? What is legally an acceptable way of the two to interact? And it's not the same in every place.
Thank you, Dan. I think it's quite clear now. Thank you. So I think it's more about discovering and finding what are your advantage or what can be your advantages than relying on those that the natural comparative advantages from classic political economists. Rainer, I would like now to turn to the questions from the audience. We have 3 questions in the chat. One of them, it's about from Carlos Oliveira, what is your view about the European Union Recovery and Resilience Program, about 2 trillion euros with its priorities on green transition and digital transformation? You mentioned, well, it is a very broad question, but I will try to focus it. You mentioned the risk of greenwashing. And also, I think that there is, we saw, I think this week in the Financial Times, a call again for austerity policy by some economists. So there is still a debate on whether we should have a more expansionist fiscal policy and this austerity policy. So I'd like to explore a bit whether if you have an opinion about this or go about this dilemma between expansionist policies and austerity policies.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most interesting bit about the program actually is that it's the first time that I think the European Commission itself, rather than the European Central Bank, took out the loan. So it's a really interesting sort of a new financial innovation, I think, for the European Union. And in some ways, it sort of creates more independence actually for the European sort of central powers, which I think is very, very important actually, because otherwise Europe is always more of a do no harm mode than radical change mode. So because the European Union is very much established on the idea of avoiding bad things rather than making good things happen, avoiding bad things such as wars between European countries. So I think in that sense, I mean, it's a very impressive program in its size, of course. And I think, as you said, or implied there, I think many countries, particularly perhaps in the South and East, actually have problems in absorbing these kind of funds if they are specifically targeted for green and digital transformation. So I think there will be probably quite a lot of issues around actually and having the capabilities to apply those funds to those areas. But at the same time, I think it's a great idea that the European Union was able to agree on these goals. So, but yeah, I think the financial innovation behind it is probably even more interesting because that opens up a fiscal space for the European Union to act down the road, perhaps more quickly than they did now, especially around vaccines, for instance.
Thank you, Rainer. We have two other questions, one by Lucas Peixoto Pinheiro da Silva and another by Rosemary Gali. They are somehow related. Lucas has asked, what are the main knowledge translation process that can be adopted to close the gap between research and policy making? So that there's, yeah. And then Rosemary asked, we have talked about a lot about the role of the state, the role of businesses and entrepreneurs, but what is the role of the universities in innovation strategy? So I suppose there could be a role in this translation process. How do you translate the knowledge advances to policy making, given there is a gap that you mentioned, Rainer, about, well, if something becomes a new concept emerges, then it is 7 years until we can reach policy, in your opinion. So first, I will turn to Dan. Dan, what's the role of universities in the type of strategies that you've been referring to, the innovation in real places?
The role of university are multiple, and I know it's the world is complex, but seriously, I think that we should first say what is not the role of the university. So university is not a magical cure for all your economic ills. Universities are not an agent of innovation. Universities, first and foremost, are an institution for research and education. And many times, even if you have some of the world's best universities, you are not going to have a successful industry around them. And I can give an example of the United Kingdom, where Professor Cattell sits, and United Kingdom have two of the world's best universities, according to the Times of Higher Education, strangely in English publication. Oxford and Cambridge are the top world universities, and UCL is not far behind. And yet, last time I checked, neither Oxford, nor Cambridge, nor UCL have created anything that resembles Silicon Valley or Hsinchu Park or Shenzhen or Tel Aviv around them. So universities are not an agent of innovation. What universities do and do very well is create the human capital, create the reservoir of knowledge, create the research, and can work with companies and entrepreneurs. And that answers your questions. The role of universities is very different in a system like Germany, which we mentioned, a system like Finland, when we mentioned, Silicon Valley in Israel, and Korea. And the way to figure out this role is to, first of all, understand what universities mainly are, as I said, the best institution in research and education, and then figuring out what the industry that you have and the industry you want to have needs and how you relate the two. Doing what too many places have done constantly around the world, and that is when nothing else works, but you have a very good university, you now tell that university, okay, create Silicon Valley now, and when they don't, because they don't, you punish them. Without mentioning the UK again at least 3 times in that sentence, is exactly the wrong way to go.
Thank you, Dan. I think that's also a wake-up call to Brazilians, because there is increasingly a push for universities to become innovators. So there are policies that say, well, universities should become, should monetize their knowledge base and so on, to create institutions to protect their IP rights and so on. And yeah, there are some people, I'm side with you, that say, well, innovation is something that firms do, not universities. So maybe you should have different type of mechanisms to create these spin-offs that you mentioned. So that how do you make academics become entrepreneurs? We actually, well, this is a side advertisements that I have. I contribute to the Rio de Janeiro Innovation Agency, and we do have a program that gives seed money to academics who want to found their own companies. So we are saying, go out of the university and create your company, and we can give you this kind of support. But it's not an easy task. We also know that. Well, we have 5 minutes to close our conversation. I promised that we would have the interaction with the audience through Mentimeter, so I will invite you again to go back to Mentimeter page, and we see here most people are in Brazil, Canada, Portugal, United States, and the UK. But the next question is for you to whether you agree or not with the following statements. So the first one, reshoring production is the most effective way to guarantee the national supply of essential products. The second one, the alignment of national and global priorities depends more on developed countries than on developing countries. Decoupling between the Chinese and American economies will certainly happen, and we are now more likely to reach multilateral agreements than we were 1 year ago. I invite Rainer to discuss any of these agreements, whether he agrees or not. And asking for the audience, you have to enter www.menti.com and enter the code 46560537, and then you will be able to rate those statements, whether you agree or not. But Rainer, what's your view on any of these given statements?
Oh yeah, I wanted to use Menti as well, but I can do live. I think you have to find a balance, as Dan was saying, that there is really, you can't produce everything anyway. So you need to have because we are open economies, so you have to have a sort of a good division of labor. I think what you want to produce and what you want to buy in and import. So I think there's something about having the absorptive capacity as well to absorb new technologies and ideas without perhaps producing them. So I think that 2.5 is probably a good balance. Oh, it's now 2.
It's changing. It's changing.
Yes. I definitely agree that at the moment, unfortunately, even if you look at what happens with the vaccination and vaccines, developed countries are very strongly in the driving seat, unfortunately. And that's and yeah, definitely the alignment, I think, is really up to them, at the moment at least, which is more unfortunate than anything else.
Yeah, the last statement, we are now more likely to reach a multilateral agreement than we were 1 year ago. There are many ways to interpret it. It could be because the pandemic made us aware that we need to work together as a global, or we could interpret it because the leader of the most powerful nation is not a douchebag anymore. Sorry, but it's true. We have Biden there. So
yeah.
What's your take on this? Do you think it's more likely because we do have a new leader, Biden, leading the United States, or is it more likely because we are now more inclined to act together?
Yeah, I think you have a good example like the global tax sort of agreement that came out a couple of weeks ago by now. I think it's a really interesting initiative, and I think it's a good towards good. It goes to the good direction, but how much more there will be actually, I'm sort of inclined to be doubtful. So I think I'm probably again in the middle of the road, 2.5 here. So, but the decoupling, I tend to agree that the decoupling is quite realistic, and as I said, it easily becomes the overarching policy logics for countries like the US, where this makes public investments into a lot of things easier because of having this, not an imagined sort of competitor or enemy in China.
Thank you, Rainer. Dan, what's your take? You can select one of these to discuss, but I would like to focus on the decoupling. Do you agree that decoupling will happen, or do you think that might not happen?
Look, I think that some decoupling, I don't know how much, will happen. And yet, I have to say that I'm not quite so sure it's a horrible thing. In the last 20 or 30 years, I think that while I love technology standards and wrote a lot about them, we have too early, I think, focused on one dominant way of playing and doing technology. I fully believe in innovation and competition. And creating a system whether we want to or not, we will have 2 or 3 constantly competing ways of how to use the same basic technology and how to innovate around them. For all that I care as a political economist, might be much better for human welfare than what we have now. And if that also means that there'll be fights about how to change and recalibrate the global IPR, intellectual property right regime, so be slightly less dysfunctional and slightly less tilted to the creation of monopoly and rents, humanity will only gain. So I want to be slightly provocative and say that it's if it will happen, it might turn out to be the best thing that happened to humanity in the last 25 years.
I agree with that.
Well, with this consensual view, then I will thank you again. I enjoyed very much our conversation. I could continue here at least 1 hour or more, but I'm sure we all have to work now a bit more. Or maybe those who are in Europe, it's really warm here, about 30 degrees. So I suppose that in the UK it's the same. You can enjoy the weather outside. But I thank also for our audience, CEBRI and CAS for inviting us to be here. And I also want to thank the Transformative Innovation Policy Consortium who allowed me to use their account of Mentimeter to do this. So thank you, Tipsy. I promised them that I would mention it. And goodbye. Thank you very much, everyone. And see you again soon.
Thank you so much for making this happen, all of you in Brazil and Holland.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, guys.
Bye. Ciao.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao.